Good evening and welcome to Off the Shelf. Tonight I'm reading another part of Resident Evil Zero Hour Chapter 4. Enjoy. Rebecca had just decided the last car was safe when the dog attacked. After leaving Billy, she'd made her way through a kitchen area in the last car, one awash in blood and fallen cookware, but otherwise empty. She was starting to wonder if some of the passengers and crew might have gotten off. Perhaps when the train had first been attacked, there was a lot of blood around for so few bodies. Considering the state of the few passengers she'd run into, maybe that was for the best. Her feet skidded through a puddle of cooking oil as she surveyed the kitchen, but her search was otherwise uneventful. The door to the rest of the car, presumably a storage area of some kind, was locked, but there was a crawl space that ran beneath the floor, with a covering she'd managed to pry up without too much trouble. She wasn't happy about having to crawl into a dark hole, but it was a short tunnel, just a couple of meters. Besides, she told Billy she would start at the back of the train, and she meant to be thorough. Doing a decent job was something to hold on to in the midst of such madness. The virus victims were bad enough, but that man made out of leeches. Don't think about it. Find the key card, stop the train, go get some real help. Someone besides a convicted killer, thank you very much. Billy was her only port in the storm, so to speak, and he'd certainly saved her ass. By trusting him any further than she'd absolutely had to would be idiotic. She'd been right about the next compartment. After a thankfully brief claustrophobic crawl, she stood up in a storage space, barely lit by a single hanging bulb. There were boxes and bins along the walls, mostly hidden in deep shadow. She swept the darkness with her weapon. Nothing moved but the train itself, rocking along the track. At the back of the compartment was a door with a window in it. Rebecca stepped closer, 9mm extended. Saw darkness and movement on the other side. The sound of the train louder, and realized she was actually in the last car, looking out over the track. She felt a flutter of something like relief just knowing that the world still existed out there, and that if worst came to worst, she could always jump. The train was going pretty fast, but it was an option. Click. She spun at the soft sound behind her, heart hammering, aiming at nothing. The train kept rolling along, the shadows pitching and swaying, the sound not repeated. After a tense moment, she took a deep breath, blew it out. Probably one of the boxes shifting, like the rest of this car. Well, the first floor anyway. The storage compartment seemed to be safe. She doubted there'd be a key card floating around, but at least she could say she looked. Click, 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 click. Rebecca froze. The sound was right next to her, and she knew what it was. Anyone who'd ever had a dog would know. The tick of toenails on a hard surface. She slowly turned her head to the right, to where she now saw there were a couple of dog carriers, both of which their doors standing open and emerging from the shadows behind the closest. It all happened fast. With a vicious snarl, the dog leaped. She had time to register that it was like the others she'd seen, huge, infected, damaged, and then her right foot came up, the action reflexive. She kicked out hard and caught one side of the creature's barrel chest with her heel. With a horrible wet tearing sound she heard, as well as felt a sizable flap of the animal's chest slough away, the skin sliding off the graying muscle, the wet and matted fur sticking to the bottom of her oily shoe. Suddenly the dog ignored the wound and kept coming, its jaws wide and dripping. It would have her before she could get the gun up. She knew it. She could already feel the teeth clamping on her arm, and she also knew that a bite from this dog would kill her, would turn her into one of the walking near dead. And before the teeth actually touched, her other foot, slick with oil, skidded out from beneath her. Rebecca hit the floor, banging her hip, and the dog flew overhead, a smell like rotten meat washing over her. It actually stepped on her, one back paw smearing dirt on her left shoulder as it bounded over the momentum of its lunge, carrying it past. The wildly lucky fall had only bought her a second. She rolled onto her stomach, extended her arm, and fired, catching the animal as it turned to lunge again. The first shot went high. The second found its mark, just below the poor beast's left eye. The dog sagged to the floor, dead before it had stopped moving. Blood began to spread around the fallen dog, and Rebecca scrambled away, pushing herself to her feet. Beyond the very basics, virology wasn't her specialty. But she was willing to bet that the dog's blood was hot, highly infected, and she wasn't interested in catching whatever was going around. This wasn't a common head cold. Assuming this is a virus, she thought, staring down at the decayed mess that had been a canine. It made as much sense as anything else, the mysterious T-virus Billy had talked about. How had it spread? What was the rate of toxicity? How quickly did it amplify once inside a host's body? She scraped the sole of her shoe against one of the kennels, hoping that she'd be able to erase that wet ripping sound from her memory as easily, and saw something glitter from the shadows. She leaned down, picked up a small gold ring, notched in an unusual design. It didn't appear to be real gold. Was probably worthless, but it was pretty, and she was lucky to be standing there looking at it, all things considered. Which makes this a lucky ring, she said, and slipped it on her left index finger. It was nearly a perfect fit. The ring was all she found. There was no key card lying around. Nothing useful. She stepped out onto the back platform for a moment and was instantly drenched. The storm was torrential, and the train was moving much too quickly to consider jumping. Her hope soared briefly when she saw a panel labeled Emergency Brake Line, but a few taps at the controls proved it to be powerless. So much for emergencies. She went back inside, pushing her wet hair off her forehead. Time to head forward. Try searching the bodies of the men that she and Billy had killed. As distasteful as the thought was, there wasn't much of an alternative. They didn't know if anyone was driving the train, or if it was a runaway. Either way, they needed to get control. She looked back at the dog one more time before leaving. By the door this time, thinking of how lucky she'd been, how easily she could have been bitten or mauled to death. No way she would let her guard down again. She only hoped Billy was having better luck. And that is it for part of Chapter 4 of Resident Evil Zero Hour. Good night. We'll see you again next time.